Hello, I'm Erik Wait, and I thought I would share with you my theological journey. Some of the most influential thinkers in my theological development, and what I'm going to call a Kildalton theological journey. And I'll explain what Kildalton is. Well, I was born in 1966 in Oakland, California, in what I would describe as a highly compromised and seriously psychological and spiritual dysfunctional fundamentalist dispensational Baptist family. Now, the psychological and spiritual dysfunctionalism doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the dispensational and Baptist. I'm just saying I grew up with both of those. So we went to church when I was a wee lad, but in my late elementary school years, my father stopped taking his family to church. That's contributing to the dysfunctionalness of it. There were Bibles on the coffee table, probably a lot of the Scofield Reference Bible in the living room, and my mom led prayers at the dinner table, but my father was not the spiritual leader of the home. My father, by the way, passed away in April 2009, and my mom in September 2014. So they're both gone now. Now, we'll say my father came around, I would say, in his later years, but he never really owned up to his lack of being the spiritual father in the home, and it definitely had a huge negative consequence on the family. But I won't go any more into that. So there was no real Bible reading, no catechism, and so what I knew of the faith was what I had gleaned from Sunday school and deciphered from celebrations of Christmas and Easter growing up. In 1970, Hal Lindsey released his book, The Late Great Planet Earth. So growing up, I heard a lot about dispensationalism and the rapture. The New York Times declared it to be the best-selling nonfiction book of the 1970s. And the book was first featured on a primetime television special featuring Hal Lindsey in 1974 and in 1975 with an audience of 17 million. And it was adapted into a 1978 film narrated by Orson Welles.
Man is faced by unprecedented perils that threaten to send him crashing into extinction.
Now, from Hal Lindsey's incredible best-selling book comes the film which explores the terrifying prophecies of the Revelations.
Is our planet truly in mortal peril?
The Late Great Planet Earth, featuring Orson Welles.
The Late Great Planet Earth from Hal Lindsey's incredible best-selling book starts Friday at your theater. Look for this ad. Rated PG from Pacific International.
And I remember a lot of people in the church talking about it, and it had a huge impact on what I heard growing up. Israel become a nation in 1948, Jerusalem become a capital in 1967. Hey, the rapture's got to be coming back anytime soon. That's what I heard growing up in the 1970s. A lot of speculation about who the Antichrist is, so on and so forth. I'll get more into that in a future lesson on eschatology. Well, my four brothers and I went to government schools, so I was taught the doctrines of Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud, but I never, by the grace of God, bought into their philosophy, their worldview. I would say that's sort of the trifecta, or the evil trinity of Western civilization is Karl Marx, Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud. So Darwin provides the overall worldview, Karl Marx then applies it to sociology and economics, and then Freud to the individual. There was never a time in which I did not believe in the basic tenets of the Christian faith, and that is the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ and the doctrine of the Trinity. So I have no experience of going from a non-Christian worldview to a Christian worldview, but there have been significant paradigm shifts throughout my life. I was baptized after I graduated from high school in the summer of 1984. Now, during my, I would say, late junior high school years, I wasn't in the church. Most of my brothers weren't in the church. My father wasn't in the church. I think only my mother really was attending church during that time period. And all of that is due to the influence of my father. Going to government schools, the only indoctrination you're getting is from the government. It seems just about any class you had, somehow they'd find a way to fit in something about evolution. And since there was no spiritual leadership in the home, there were Bibles on the coffee table and we celebrate Christmas and stuff, but there's no catechism and no reading of the Bible or anything like that. So I only had like a very basic understanding of the Christian worldview. So in the end of my high school years, I spent my high school years doing a lot of things that typical rebellious teenagers do. But at the end of my high school years, I realized what I believed deep down inside versus what I was doing. There was a conflict there. So I actually went back to the church, started going to church, and got baptized. But shortly after that, in 1985, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. My first duty station was Camp Pendleton in San Diego. And shortly after my arrival, I was introduced to Calvary Chapel. If you're not familiar with Calvary Chapel started with Chuck Smith, Southern California, mildly charismatic, Baptistic in terms of sacraments, although they even when you use the word sacraments, there's no ever really talk about the church history. There's no creeds. There's no confessions. I think since then they have formalized as a denomination. Very, 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 very dispensational, sort of almost hyper-dispensational and a preoccupation with end-time speculations. Chuck Smith and Chuck Missler in Calvary Chapel, big influence on that. But the advantage was, I'm going to say this for Calvary Chapel, is they did take you through the Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, so they had a strong emphasis on the Bible, which was good. They also had a radio station which broadcast throughout all of Southern California. It was called K-Wave. I believe it was 107.9 FM. Now, you got to remember, this is the 1980s. There's no internet. And so if in terms of exposure to Christian teaching, it's going to be at church, Calvary Chapel, and then most of the speakers on K-Wave were Calvary Chapel pastors. They did for a while have people like Chuck Swindoll, I think Jack Hayford, and maybe John MacArthur for a while, but eventually became predominantly Calvary Chapel pastors. Now, the advantage of that was Calvary Chapel in Southern California is sort of like Starbucks. There's one in every town, at least one in every town. And you could listen to the same music that you sang at church, you would hear on the radio, and you would learn about various Calvary Chapels and the pastors on the radio. So whether all the way up near the LA area or all the way down in San Diego, you could listen to K-Wave. It was KWVE was the radio station. So the pros and cons, the pros were, you did get exposure to the Bible. You did have Christian music. Back then, it was a lot of Maranatha singers. Calvary Chapel, they would have a lot of concerts, stuff like that, and it was sort of a youth community. And so, the theology, I would say, I don't agree with the charismatic movement and the hyper-dispensationalism and Baptistic view of baptism and the Lord's Supper. Also, generally very Arminian, very, very Arminian, although they didn't have like an official statement on it. You could find some pastors who are a little bit more Calvinistic, but generally are Arminian. Years later, they had a Calvary Chapel Bible College. Rich Goswell led the college, and he was Calvinist, much more of a same with John MacArthur type. And a lot of students were coming out of the college who were coming out as Calvinists, probably annoyingly so, and going back home where they came from with all hyped up on Calvinism. And oftentimes, young Calvinists can be quite annoying with it. They want to beat it over everybody's head with it, which probably didn't reflect on Rich Goswell, and subsequently, he left Calvary Chapel, was no longer the teacher at the school, and Calvary Chapel was more or less sort of not quite kicking him out, but if you were a Calvinist and you talked about it, basically, you were persona non grata. You weren't going to stick around Calvary Chapel very long. I didn't go to Calvary Chapel Bible College, but I talked to Rich Goswiller and over the telephone, and he said, look, if you're going reformed in your theology, then you have no future in Calvary Chapel. So I left. All right. So the Calvary Chapel that I primarily went to was Calvary Chapel Vista, and Brian Broderson was the pastor at the time. It was the closest probably to Camp Pendleton, although there was another one in Oceanside. But because the different Calvary Chapels had Bible studies, midweek Bible studies, and different times of the week, it was actually kind of cool because I could go to 2 services on Sunday and probably to a Bible study almost every day of the week, because you could go to different Calvary Chapels, generally same sort of teaching, and you could stay busy in church rather than getting into trouble with your fellow Marines, because a lot of my fellow Marines were into partying, and one way to stay out of it was to be at church all the time. So at the time, would listen to, say, Raul Reese, Calvary Chapel Diamond Bar, Greg Laurie at Harvest Christian Fellowship, and I remember going visiting them. In fact, one time Raul Reese was visited Camp Pendleton. He was into surfing, and he was surfing at San Onofre Beach, which is on Camp Pendleton, and happened to run into him there at the beach. And he was a former Marine. Anyhow, so you could, the Lord used Calvary Chapel in a positive way. Provided a Christian environment, provided some good, I would say, Christian influences, and it was a better environment than being hanging out with a lot of fellow Marines. In 1986, so I was in the Marine Corps from 1985 to 1989. In 1986, Dr. R.C. Sproul published his book, Chosen by God. This was probably the first major theological paradigm shift. A fellow Marine who was a lieutenant, I was an enlisted man, I met at church, loaned me a cassette tape series, Chosen by God, in which R.C. Sproul, I believe, if I recall correctly, I think it was 3 cassette tapes, 6 messages, 1 on each side of the cassette tape. I listened to the entire series while driving back home up to the Bay Area. It's about an 8-hour drive from Camp Pendleton up to the Bay Area. I grew up in Walnut Creek, California. So by the time I got home, I listened to the entire series, and boom, made sense to me, and I became, at least in terms of the doctrine of election, became a Calvinist. Now, more than that, I would say R.C. Sproul sparked a fire in me to want to learn more. And he mentions a lot of names that I had never heard before. People like John Calvin, obviously, Martin Luther, maybe he mentioned John Knox, Jonathan Edwards, and so on and so forth. So I that sort of, who I wanted to know more. I wanted more than what I was getting at church. Well, later on, this same lieutenant introduced me to Westminster Theological Seminary in Escondido, California, which is, again, not too far from Vista, not too far from Camp Pendleton. Now, basically, he showed me around the campus. We went to the bookstore, and right there, I was like, this is where I want to go. I want to go to Westminster Theological Seminary in California. Well, in 1989, my service in the Marine Corps ended, and I moved back to the San Francisco Bay Area, and I enrolled in college in 1990. I had a desire to study the Bible and theology, and yet also study law enforcement. So I first earned an AA degree in criminal justice, which made up most of my career for the next 20 years. Well, in 1991, shortly after I got out of the Marine Corps, from R.C. Sproul and Ligonier Ministries, I learned about John Gerstner, and I read his book, Wrongly Dividing the Word of Truth, a Critique of Dispensationalism, which I also bought a video series from him on the Westminster Confession of Faith. From listening to R.C. Sproul, I became a Calvinist. So at that time, I was probably more like a John MacArthur type in my theology, Baptistic, Calvinistic, and dispensational in my eschatology. But from John Gerstner, really sort of opened my eyes to what is wrong in the hermeneutics of dispensationalism. And so now I'm really venturing away from dispensationalism and going more towards a fully Reformed theology. Well, in 1992, Michael Horton and an organization called CURE, Christians United for Reformation, Mike Horton released a book called Christ the Lord, the Reformation and Lordship Salvation. This book, along with John Gerstner's Wrongly Dividing the Word of Truth, led me out of dispensationalism. So John Gerstner, more in terms of the hermeneutic and really the flawed history, or say questionable history of dispensationalism, and then this book by Michael Horton, or edited by Michael Horton, really emphasizing the Lordship of Christ and really what was wrong with dispensationalism in the Lordship salvation issue within dispensationalism. So I really saw dispensationalism not merely as an eschatological system, as mostly what you're going to get from say, like from John MacArthur, but as a hermeneutical system that seriously distorts the Bible's teaching on the covenant, the identity of the church, and the hope of the Christian. And this was, I would say, was the second largest paradigm shift since listening to R.C. Sproul's Chosen by God. Now, until that time, I was theologically in line with John MacArthur, but it was John Gerstner that got me out of dispensationalism, after which I became, by default, I would say, a millennial in my eschatology. Well, it was then at that time that I left Calvary Chapel that I was attending in Northern California and began visiting a Christian Reformed church. You gotta remember, this is early 1990s. There is no internet. There is no Reformed teaching on the radio. I would buy blank cassette tapes, mail them to a friend down in LA, and he would record the radio broadcast of CURE, Christians United for Reformation, and mail them back to me. So there's no Reformed teaching on the radio. You know, if you listen to Reformed teaching on the internet, on YouTube or something, you don't know how good you've got it. So I was really hungry and thirsty to learn more of the Reformed faith. And I had a huge collection of cassette tapes by R.C. Sproul. I had probably just almost all of them. And then I had tapes that I was getting of the CURE broadcast. In fact, eventually CURE was on the radio like 1 o'clock in the morning. And I would set my alarm to get up at 1 o'clock in the morning and have my cassette tape in the radio and record the broadcast. In 1993, I had been listening to tapes by CURE that a friend was sending me of the radio broadcast, The White Horse Inn. And through CURE, I met a guy named Robert Zerhusen. Robert Zerhusen did a series for CURE for The White Horse Inn on the issue of tongues. Well, he sent me a tape that was a debate between Greg Bonson and Gordon Stein called Does God Exist? That was recorded in 1985 at UC Irvine. You can still listen to this now for free on YouTube. This was another major theological shift, another paradigm shift, particularly in regards to apologetics, as I had previously been more in line with, say, Dr. Walter Martin, who founded the Bible Answer Man, and Hank Hanegraaff. More than that, Greg Bonson introduced me to a number of other theologians, all of who had been students of someone named Cornelius Van Til. So at this time, I'd been listening to Hank Hanegraaff on the radio as an apologetic program. I got my AA degree in criminal justice. In order to use the funds from the military, what's called the Montgomery Bill, people refer to it as a GI Bill, I had to go to an accredited college. But there's only one Christian college at the time in the San Francisco Bay Area that was accredited, and it was this Pentecostal charismatic college called Patton. It's now called Patton University. So my junior year and senior year, I went to Patton University. Now here I am going more Reformed, more Calvinist, but I'm attending this charismatic Pentecostal university because it was the only school that I could go to and use my GI Bill, or the Montgomery Bill, to pay for the college. I did my first 2 years at a secular junior college, and I was just really, really, really hungry to go to a Christian school, and I was tired of all the evolution garbage that would get crammed down your throat just about any class you took in college, and all the liberalism and all that. So Greg Bahnsen, he lived from 1948 to 1995. He was a minister in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and a full-time scholar in residence for the Southern California Center for Christian Studies, which I don't think exists anymore. He also is considered a contributor to the field of Christian apologetics as he popularized the presuppositional method of Cornelius Van Til. Unfortunately, due to his lifelong medical problems, Greg Bahnsen had to undergo a third aortic valve implant surgery on December 5th, 1995. And after the completion of the operation, serious complications developed within 24 hours. He then became comatose for several days and died on December 11th, 1995, at the age of 47, just a few months before I became a student at Westminster Theological Seminary, California, which was later renamed Westminster Seminary, California. Well, another transition going here. So I had gone from Calvary Chapel to the Christian Reformed Church. And the Christian Reformed Church at that time was going more and more liberal. So I went from Calvary Chapel to what I was hoping would be a Reformed church environment, but it turned out to be more or less just a haven for Dutch people. And it was going more liberal. And the last day I was there, they had this Jamming for Jesus praise band. And I just kind of sighed, and I'm just like, this is why I left Calvary Chapel, this kind of nonsense. But I was going to go down to Westminster Seminary, and I already had plans on going there. So I actually went to a Calvinistic Baptistic church, Grace Bible Church. It was originally in Walnut Creek. It's now in Pleasant Hill. And then the pastor there is Tony Sinelli. He's a graduate from Master Seminary, and we became good friends. And he actually wrote my pastoral letter to go to Westminster Seminary. I'll give you a long story short. The church I grew up in was Grace Bible Church in Walnut Creek. It joined with First Baptist of Pleasant Hill, which is the next town over. It went from being First Baptist Pleasant Hill to Christian Fellowship Church, non-denominational. Well, they went through a number of over the years, different pastoral changes. Tony Sinelli of Grace Bible Church in Walnut Creek then became the pastor of this church in Pleasant Hill, and the name went over to Pleasant Hill, Grace Bible Church in Pleasant Hill. Long story short. And so I was sort of there during that sort of transitional period there. And so my mother then was a member of Grace Bible Church, where Pastor Tony Sinelli is at, and Pastor Tony Sinelli wrote my letter to go to Westminster Theological Seminary. So I've always been on, I would say, good friendly terms with Baptists. My mom being one. Now they don't call themselves a Baptist, but essentially it's a Calvinistic Baptist church that actually holds to presuppositional apologetics. So some of the most influential books by Greg Bahnsen are his book on theonomy and Christian ethics, his book By This Standard, Van Til's Apologetic, Readings and Analysis, and Presuppositional Apologetics, Stated and Defended. Well, in 1996, at the beginning of the year, I moved from the San Francisco Bay Area to the San Diego area in order to attend Westminster Theological Seminary, a school I had visited 10 years earlier when I was in the Marine Corps. My professors included Dr. Robert Godfrey, who was the president in church history. I believe he's retired now. Stephen Baugh, who taught Greek. Robert Strumpel, who taught New Testament. Peter Jones, who taught New Testament. Dennis Johnson, who taught New Testament. Joseph Pipa, who taught church history, and he was my pastor at Trinity PCA in Escondido. Dirk Bergsma, who taught homiletics. Meredith Klein, who taught Old Testament. Mark Furtado, who taught Hebrew. And then just towards the end of my time at Westminster Seminary, Michael Horton came on staff, and R.C. Sproul was a visiting professor, and I was able to have a class with Dr. R.C. Sproul on the providence of God. I got to have him autograph a book. Now, I had looked at going to Reformed-Theological Seminary because R.C. Sproul was a teacher there, RTS in Florida. But because Westminster Seminary was in California and I could get a job transfer down to Southern California, I went to Westminster, and providentially, R.C. Came and taught there. And I got to meet him again also. There was a Ligonier conference in Pasadena. I believe he debated John MacArthur on the issue of baptism. I don't think R.C. Sproul did all that great of a job. So R.C. Sproul really is probably one of the most important and most influential people in my life, particularly my theological teaching. The ability to teach complex subjects at a very simple level, and to make Reformed theology available to lay people. And sort of like what I'm trying to do is bridge a gap to provide a higher level of education to lay people. Now, while I was a student at Westminster, the professor who had the greatest impact on my thinking was John Frame. And John Frame had been a professor of Greg Bunson. John Frame, who taught, I had a class on the doctrine of God and the doctrine of the Christian mind, and I believe the doctrine of the Christian life. So you can buy these books by John Frame with those titles, but back in those days, these were his lecture notes that then later got published as books. So the influence that John Frame had on me was namely in developing a distinctive Christian worldview and with a distinctively biblical epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. And some of the most influential by John Frame are the Doctrine and Knowledge of God, which is on epistemology, Doctrine of Christian Life, which is on ethics, Doctrine of the Word of God, and Cornelius Van Til, an analysis of his thought. Now, I will say a lot of John Frame's teaching is reflected in mine, but with my own kind of tweaking of it. I'm not going to explain it right here, but John Frame is what's called a tri-perspectivalist, the normative, the situational, and the existential. I've kind of taken that and tweaked it and just maintained the three categories of philosophy, namely epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics, and then I put it in the form of a pyramid representing the top of the pyramid, representing the position of authority. So if you've watched any of my classes thus far, Bibliology or hermeneutics, you've seen this model used in there. I got that from John Frame, and then put my own little tweak on it. So another major influence on my thinking was Cornelius Van Til, who lived from 1895 until 1987. He was a Dutch-American Reformed theologian who is credited as being the originator of what is commonly referred to as presuppositional apologetics. He was a professor at Princeton Seminary, but as the seminary, what we now know as the Presbyterian Church USA, plunged into liberalism, he left with a conservative group of professors that founded Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, where he taught for 43 years. He taught apologetics and systematic theology there until his retirement in 1972, and he continued to teach occasionally until 1979. He was also a minister in the Christian Reformed Church in North America, which has also gone liberal, and in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church from the 1930s until his death in 1987. So I had first heard about Cornelius Van Til from Greg Bunson on tape, but then learned more about him through John Frame. And so I never met Cornelius Van Til, never learned directly from him, but it was really through John Frame that I learned about Cornelius Van Til and read a lot of his writings. So the key to Van Tilian thinking is, number one, maintaining the antithesis of the Christian worldview and all other worldviews. Number two, the myth of neutrality, that is, all worldviews have epistemological presuppositions through which they interpret reality. Third, defending the faith, that is, apologetics, therefore, must be at the presuppositional worldview level. Fourth, this form of presuppositional apologetics is most well known for what is called the Transcendental Argument for the Existence of God, or TAG. And I'll get more into that in a series on apologetics. Now, Cornelius Van Til was very influential on a number of theologians who then took his thought and applied it in a number of other theological subjects, all of whom have had a major impact on my theological development, and I hope to carry the implications of it further on other theological topics. Some of the most well-known Van Tilian theologians who applied his thinking to other areas are John Frame, Greg Bahnsen, R.J. Rushdoony, J. Adams, and K. Gentry. Some of the most influential books by Rushdoony are The Institutes of Biblical Law, Volumes 1, 2, and 3, and his Systematic Theology, Volumes 1 and 2. J. Adams applied Van Tilian thinking to the subject of Christian counseling, commonly referred to as nouthetic counseling. This is antithetical to the forms of counseling which are syncretistic with non-Christian worldviews, namely Freudianism, as practiced by Dr. James Dobson, and sadly is now being taught at Westminster Seminary, California. Now, what was Westminster Theological Seminary in California was a plant in California spawned from Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. California changed its name to distance itself from Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia because it has changed in its theology, but I'll save that for another day. I'll talk more about that. There's a book by John Frame, which I think covered it fairly well, called Escondido Theology. And a lot of the professors, I think some of the best professors they had at Westminster when I was there, Joseph Pipa left to become the president of Greenville. John Frame went to go to RTS. George Scipione, who taught counseling, left there as well. So some of the most influential books by J. Adams are The Theology of Christian Counseling, Competent to Counsel, and the Christian Counselor's Manual. Well, the third and probably the most recent paradigm shift in my understanding of the biblical Christian worldview came from reading the works of Ken Gentry. I've never met him in person. I've listened to him and watched him on YouTube, but it's really his work on eschatology that was the next major shift in my thinking. And I would say some of the most influential books by Ken Gentry are Before Jerusalem Fell, which is about the dating of the book of Revelation, and a really simple book is the book of Revelation Made Easy. Now, I have a lot more books by Ken Gentry, but I would say those are the two that I would highly recommend. So R.C. Sproul introduced me to the Reformed faith. John Gerstner got me out of dispensationalism as a hermeneutical system, after which I became by default amillennial in my eschatology. Greg Bahnsen introduced me to presuppositional apologetics. John Frame helped me develop a more biblical epistemology, and Rushdoony a more covenantal approach to systematic theology and applying God's law. It was Ken Gentry who helped me better understand the book of Revelation, its dating and meaning, as well as other related texts of scripture such as Matthew 24 and Daniel chapter 7. Subsequently, I went from being amillennial to what is commonly referred to as optimistic amillennialism or modern postmillennialism, which is different than an older Puritan postmillennialism. While there are many more theologians, pastors, and teachers have influenced my thinking, there are too many to mention, but these have been the most influential. So obviously, historically, if I want to talk historically influential thinkers, you want to go Augustine, John Calvin, Jonathan Edwards. I've read the complete works of Jonathan Edwards. I took a course on Jonathan Edwards. Probably Wilhelmus of Brakel, not real well-known Dutch theologian. Abraham Kuyper. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. The list goes on and on. And I've got a lot of books here. But in terms of more recent thinkers, it's these ones I just covered that have been the most impactful on my thinking. So you might be wondering then, what is with this Kildalton? What is that? Well, the Kildalton Cross is a monolithic high cross in Celtic cross form in the churchyard of the former parish church of Kildalton on the island of Islay in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland. Kildalton in Scottish Gaelic means Church of the Foster Son, referring to St. John the Evangelist. As we read in John chapter 19, verses 26 to 27, when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing thereby, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour the disciple took her into his own household. It was carved in the second half of the 8th century AD and is closely related to crosses of similar date on Iona. It is often considered the finest surviving Celtic cross in Scotland and is certainly one of the most perfect monuments of its date to survive Western Europe. I have visited Scotland as of this date 4 times. Something I didn't mention through all this is I'm a certified sommelier with the Court of Master Sommeliers, a French wine scholar at the Wine Scholar Guild. I have certifications from the Wine Spirit Educational Trust. And actually, I went back to college and studied enology or winemaking. And in 2016, while studying for certifications with the Wine Spirit Educational Trust, I got introduced to whiskey. And so I have been a student of whiskey since 2016. And I've made 4 trips to Scotland, visited 49 distilleries, spent a week working at Springbank Distillery, spent a day working at Ballindow Distillery. So, in addition to studying theology, I've been studying wine and whiskey for the last 20 plus years. So I have visited the Kildalton Cross twice on the Isle of Islay. And when you see it and you touch it and you think, wow, this is 1,300 years old. This cross predates the split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church in 1054. This cross predates the Protestant Reformation. And so I kind of, and yet somehow out here on this island off the coast of Scotland, there were Christians in which there was more or less some sort of unified church. So Ardbeg Distillery, which is one of my favorite distilleries, produces a special bottling. There's a bottle of whiskey in here. And the funds from buying this bottle go to help preserve the chapel. I'll show you the bottle. There you go, Ardbeg. Very heavily peaty, very meaty and delicious whiskey. One of my favorite distilleries. So, in starting this YouTube channel, I didn't want to name it after a particular denomination, although theologically, obviously, you can tell I'm mostly of the Reformed-Presbyterian influence. But I didn't want to name it after a particular denomination or after a particular person, and I didn't want to brand my own name. You may notice I don't ever ask for likes, subscribes, or Patreons, and I'm not trying to detract or take anything away from what this channel is all about, which is learning about theology, learning to love God with all your heart and all your mind, and to provide for the church what I think the church is not providing for lay people, which is a deeper theological education. So, the basic goal of Kildalton Biblical-Theological Studies is to bridge the gap between what is typically available to lay people in the church and what is available to seminarians who have to pay tens of thousands of dollars in order to get an education. So, that is my Kildalton journey. And I could say so much more. There is so much more to than just abstract doctrines. It's having, I would say, particularly, there's so many stories I could share, particularly in my travels around Scotland, of the understanding the sovereignty of God and the providence of God in my travels, and so many circumstances and events that have happened. Like many others, I've been through trials and tribulations, deaths in the family, and all kinds of drama, which I'm not going to go into. And as in going through these hard times, that one of the things that has sustained me is a solid theological understanding of God, a full confidence in the sovereignty and in the providence of God, and in the hope of the resurrection. When my mother died in 2014, I probably spent more time reading and thinking about the resurrection than I ever had at any other time. All right, so I hope you have learned and benefited from this. And in the future, I'll recommend more books by these theologians and others. And until next time, may the Lord richly bless you.